Sorry. While we're waiting for our second panel to be seated, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to place into the record an article from the Washington Examiner. 2/3 of swing state voters reject the Biden administration's restrictions on appliances, and ask unanimous consent that be part of the record. I want to welcome our second panel, Representative Andy Biggs and Ranking Member Jamie Raskin from the Committee of Oversight and Accountability. Representative Biggs, I welcome your testimony.
Did I get on? Yeah, it looks like it's on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McGovern. I'm pleased to announce, you probably didn't notice it, but I did get a haircut since the last time I was in front of your committee. So you may not be thrilled by that, but my wife was. So I urge today the passage in the Rules Committee to grant a prompt appropriate rule for the House's consideration of H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act. Reporting out H.R. 7109, the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability holds the decennial census should collect information about the citizenship status of our population. It is a basic data point that should be available to policymakers and the public, and adding a citizenship question on the decennial census questionnaire is the best way to obtain accurate information. Adding a citizenship question is an appropriate exercise of Congress's Article I authority over the census, and I just want to refer you briefly and discuss a little bit of the Department of Commerce versus New York case. The court in that particular case noted a host of various questions over the years that are tangential, frankly, to apportionment that have been asked on censuses. For instance, the court, and I will quote them, noted race, sex, age, health, education, occupation, housing, military service, radio ownership, age at first marriage, native tongue, close quote. Additionally, on other occasions, we've made inquiries into toilet facilities in the homes of people through the census. How many times has citizenship been actually asked on the census questionnaire? The court noted, quote, every census between 1820 and 2000, with the exception of 1840, asked at least some of the population about their citizenship or place of birth. Between 1820 and 1950, the question was asked of all households. Between 1960 and 2000, it was asked of about 1/4 to 1/6 of the population. Additionally, the court said more detailed demographic questions previously asked on the long-form questionnaire, including the question about citizenship, were instead asked on the American Community Survey, which is set each year to a rotating sample of about 2.6% of households, close quote. What that indicates is that over a 10-year period, about 1/4 of the entire population would be asked that question over the decennial census. The United Nations recommends collecting citizenship information via census. The court noted that the following other additional countries also ask citizenship questions in their respective censuses: Australia, Canada, France, Indonesia, Ireland, Germany, Mexico, Spain, and the UK. You'll note that the U.S., if it continues on without asking this question, will be the only North American state not to inquire about citizenship in its census protocols. Ultimately, the court held this, quote, in light of the early understanding of and long practice under the enumeration clause, we conclude that it permits Congress, and by extension the Secretary, meaning the Secretary of Commerce, to inquire about citizenship on the census questionnaire. Close quote. We must also restore the one person, one vote principle in apportionment by including only citizens, the voters, in the apportionment-based used to apportion representation in the House of Representatives and allocate electoral college votes. The Equal Representation Act would do just that. It would exercise Congress's authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to, quote, enforce by appropriate legislation, end quote, the provisions of the 14th Amendment, including Section 2 relating to apportionment by excluding non-citizens from the apportionment base. This is now even more necessary given the Biden administration's failure to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, close quote, when it comes to enforcing immigration law. Under this administration, we have not only witnessed a failure to enforce the law against millions of illegal aliens, but affirmative actions to abuse limited statutory authority to parole over 1 million inadmissible aliens into the United States. If H.R. 7109 is not passed into law, these millions of illegal aliens will be counted for purposes of apportionment, eroding the one-person, one-vote principle. And in the long line of cases that deal with census and apportionment, the term that the courts have consistently used is when you erode the one-person, one-vote, they've used the term debasing the vote of the people. We should not reward the President's failure to perform his constitutional duties, especially where that failure has transcended mere incompetence to, by all purposes, purposely engineer strategic electoral advantage for the President's party. With that, Mr. Chairman, you look forward to answering your questions, and I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for his statement.
Chairman Burgess, thank you very much. Always a delight to be back in the Rules Committee. We could do what the gentleman from Arizona invites us to do, but it would be completely unconstitutional. The last president tried to include a citizenship question on the decennial census in 2020 and to count only U.S. citizens in the census, as this legislation would do, and it failed for completely obvious reasons. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment states that apportionment of seats in the House is based on a count of, quote, the whole number of persons in each state, unquote, persons being the all-encompassing category larger than that of citizens or voters. When the framers wanted to impose a citizenship requirement, they sure knew how to do it. For example, when they said that the president must be a born U.S. citizen and not a naturalized citizen. Some people think that was because Thomas Jefferson was moving to block Alexander Hamilton from running for president. But in any event, it's right in the Constitution, just like it says we, as members of the House, we have to be U.S. citizens for at least 7 years, which is why if you've been naturalized in the last 3 or 4 years, you can't do it. The Supreme Court has been perfectly clear about this and made this point emphatically in a unanimous 2016 decision called Evanwell versus Abbott. And like this legislation itself, Evanwell involved a challenge to congressional apportionment based on a total count of the entire population instead of just a count of the voter population. But Justice Ginsburg held for the unanimous court that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, quote, retained total population as the congressional apportionment base. She cited the speech made by Senator Jacob Howard upon introduction of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Quote, he said, the basis of representation is numbers. The committee adopted numbers as the most just and satisfactory basis, and this is the principle upon which the Constitution itself was originally framed, that the basis of representation should depend upon numbers. And such, I think, after all, is the safest and most secure principle upon which the government can rest. Numbers, not voters. Numbers, not property. This is the theory of our Constitution. Justice Ginsburg included lots of decisive legislative authority like this, including the floor statement of Representative James Blaine, who stated that, quote, no one will deny that population is the true basis of representation. For women, children, and other non-voting classes may have as vital an interest in the legislation of the country as those who actually deposit the ballot. And therefore, they all must be counted. For all of you constitutional textualists out there, the plain reading of the text is clear. Clear as day. For all of you constitutional originalists, the original purposes of the passage of the 14th Amendment have been carefully articulated and revisited repeatedly by the Supreme Court and never rebutted by any contrary legislative authority. For all of you members who like to follow precedent, every apportionment since 1790 has included every single person residing in the United States, not just those lucky enough to be given the right to vote. As the Evanwell Court noted, the 14th Amendment contemplates that representatives serve all residents, not just those eligible to vote. You don't enforce the 14th Amendment under Section 5 by violating the terms of the constitutional amendment. The meaning is indisputable, a point which settles this for anyone who wants to follow the Constitution's text and original public meaning in all cases, not just when the text favors our desired policy outcome. I remember the admonition from the former chairman of this committee, the gentleman from Oklahoma, who would tell us that we should get our work done and not waste time on legislation that will never pass the Senate, never get signed by the president, and certainly never be approved by the Supreme Court. This bill is an affront to the great radical Republicans who wrote the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, which has always made persons, not voters, the basis for reapportionment. The census is essential to democracy, just as the framers endorsed Tom Paine's common sense. They endorsed a common census. This bill would destroy the accuracy of the census, which may have something to do with its real legislative motivation. In the 2010 census, the undercount of Hispanic U.S. citizens was 1.4%, but in 2020, that number grew to 5%. Many observers credit that 300% plus jump to the last administration's attempt to add a citizenship question to the census and all of the publicity and rumor surrounding that attempt. The addition of a question about citizenship will deter many immigrants, not only the undocumented, but persons with green cards and people who are U.S. citizens from completing the census. Many non-citizen immigrants who are seeking asylum or are refugees will avoid responding because of uncertainty over their status and fear of arbitrary law enforcement action. Extensive research over the last decade shows that many residents wrongly believe the Census Bureau shares personal responses with other agencies. They don't. Federal law prohibits the sharing of information in this way, but that worry has prevented many people from answering questions about immigration status or responding to the census at all. Census data guide the allocation of $2.8 trillion each year in federal assistance to states, localities, and families for a broad range of vital services. An inaccurate census would skew the fair distribution of federal resources for the next decade and deprive many cities and towns in places like Texas and California of needed resources for everything from roads to hospitals and veterans care. I strongly oppose this legislation, Mr. Chairman, which dishonors and violates our Constitution and the values of our nation. I yield back.
Sure. Thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Sure. Thanks, both the witnesses. Mr. Biggs, let me just ask you, is there any response you would like to make to what Mr. Raskin has just put before us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that opportunity. So let's consider he's made essentially three arguments. He is essentially claiming that the 14th Amendment requires that every person be counted in the census. This bill doesn't stop that. Then he basically dovetails that into apportionment. And then he uses the argument that was made with regard to women and children because at the original censuses they were non-voters and so they were covered. Well, what is interesting is when you consider that, is that those women and children have been legal Americans. They were properly and legally here. He wants to apportion based on literally, by their own admission, 9.2 million. That's what they admit to. Illegal aliens being brought into this country during the term of the Biden administration. He wants those to be figured into the apportionment, which is an interesting position to take. He also argued, and then I'll expand on this in just a second. He also argued the suppression argument. The American Community Survey has asked a citizenship question every year, and they go to out to roughly 25% of the population every 10 years. And there has never, ever been an allegation or an argument that in answering in response to the American Community Survey that there's been a suppression because there was a citizenship question asked. So let's get back to this. Evan Wall held that a state may draw its legislative districts based on total population of such legislative districts within the state. That's the argument. The court specifically declined, however, in that case, to resolve the question of whether a state may draw its districts to equalize the voter-eligible population, and did not mention Congress's authority to implement Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Didn't discuss really the nub of the bill that's before you today. It's a neat trick. It's a neat trick. Evanwell does not preclude Congress from adding a citizenship question to the census questionnaire. They could have. They could have said, hey, we're afraid that you might use this for apportionment, because that's, by the way, that's what the census is supposed to be. It's for apportionment. They could have said, no, you got to count everybody. They didn't say that. That's not what they said. And so that's a neat trick that they've made there. The case Evanwell dealt with legislative maps drawn within a state by the state after apportionment of a certain number of representatives to each state. It didn't deal with the congressional authority to implement Section 2 of the 14th Amendment by amending statutes related to apportionment. 7109 does not dictate or change in any way how states will draw their legislative maps. Internally, once the number of representatives is apportioned to them, this bill only amends existing statute to require that the apportionment calculation exclude non-citizens in the first place when apportioning representatives among the various states. Evanwell actually reiterates the importance of the one-person, one-vote principle, noting that after apportionments, states design legislative districts within the state that contain roughly equal populations, and that they presume that if you're within 10 points, that's equal representation, that's one person, one vote, but yet they've approved even as high as 17% differential at one point. Evanwell held that a state may use total population when designing those districts, but did not mandate the use of voter population. Moreover, the Evanwell case turned on whether the Equal Protection Clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment requires a state to consider only voters when drawing legislative districts. The court held it did not. Justice Ginsburg's dicta that total population is contemplated in apportionment is just that. It is dicta. The Equal Representation Act makes absolutely no amendments whatsoever to any laws implicating federal assistance. Non-citizens are excluded only from the apportionment based by Section 3 of the bill. The apportionment of representatives is impacted, but not the allocation of funds. By the way, I do find it a really weird argument to make that there's going to be jurisdictions that if you count non-citizens, you know how many illegal aliens you have, that somehow the federal dollars that they're getting, because it's based on illegal immigrants, is going to be reduced. This is the same group of folks that tell you illegal aliens don't get benefits from the feds. They don't get food stamps. They don't get welfare benefits. They don't get health care benefits. They don't get these cell phones. And yet somehow they're going to tell you that these jurisdictions are going to be suppressed because of that. Well, if you were to follow that to its logical end, if you were to say, what happens if you have a jurisdiction that is after apportionment, after you've counted and you've done the apportionment, 100% of them are illegally in the country? Believe it or not, there are probably places in at least one state that I could name for you where that may well be the case, if not 100%, the vast majority may well be illegally in the country. You're not going to see suppression of federal funds based on anything other than that they're here illegally. That's why you would lose those funds. Let's see here. As to the argument that undercounts will impact assistance, that's what the Democrats, they continue to make that argument. But let's respond. First, they indicate that someone who's not a citizen does not reveal anything about the legality or illegality of that person's immigration status. So we're asking, are you to determine whether you're a U.S. citizen or not. We're not saying, are you here illegally? Second, the Census Bureau has strict confidentiality requirements. Finally, even if misinformed respondents were reluctant to complete the decennial census questionnaire, census workers would still enumerate those individuals. They still count those people, even if you don't know whether they're here illegally or not. The other thing is, I get back to the point that I was making earlier. This bill actually gets what most Americans have responded to literally, for, I think it's 22 out of the 25 decennial censuses. There's been 3 that didn't have this for most Americans. The rest have always had the same setup. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question.
Well, and I thank you for that. I mean, I think the fact is that most people do think that there is a citizenship question on the census. I mean, that is just my experience, that's been the general assumption. And when this discussion came up in the 2020 census, many people were legitimately surprised that it was not a requirement of being counted in the census. I'm going to yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. It is deeply concerning that a bill like this is a major policy priority for the Republican Party. Restricting apportionment of citizens used to be a fringe right-wing policy proposal, but now you have the Republican presidential candidate claiming that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, and we're seeing these extremist positions becoming more and more mainstream in the House majority. As Ranking Member Raskin outlined, this bill is both unconstitutional and ahistorical. The Constitution's clear. Apportionment is based on the whole number of persons in each state. That language was a specific choice by Congress. Apportionment is based on total population. I mean, we struggle now to get people to fill out the census for all kinds of reasons. People are afraid that the government might disclose the information. They're afraid to fill out the form, and a question like this will only make that problem worse. Listen to Stephen Miller or Donald Trump talk for 5 minutes, and you too would be reluctant to put your immigration status on the census. Now, I mean, I do find it deeply interesting that our colleagues are trying to rationalize this bill as necessary to ensure fair and equal apportionment to the citizens of our country. I mean, you just have to look at the difference between the representation afforded to my state, Pennsylvania, the 5th most populous in the country, and that afforded to Wyoming. Wyoming has about 500,000 people. They have 2 senators and a representative. They get way more representation in Congress. And what are we supposed to do about the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico? Those are citizens, and their representation is different here. So it does come down to, are we going to follow the Constitution? Are we going to create some really different carve-outs? And I'd appreciate any thoughts you have about that, Mr. Raskin.
Well, thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Look, the constitutional question is just clear. You read the Supreme Court, any of these decisions. If you want to change the Constitution, great, go out and change the Constitution, but you got to amend it to change it. You can't just squint really hard and see what you want to see. I mean, it's very clear what the framers did originally and what happened in the 14th Amendment as well. When the Constitution started, of course, the vast majority of people couldn't vote. And there was ambiguity about who was a citizen and who was not a citizen, and a lot of it was controlled by the states at that point. So they were very careful to use the word person. That's why, of course, we evolved to saying one person, one vote, right? Women couldn't vote at the time. Children couldn't vote, and there was a lot of ambiguity about who was a citizen or not when the country started. You know, obviously, this has been the rule from the beginning. We've never reapportioned according to the citizenship population, and that would just be a dramatic and unconstitutional departure from everything that we've done before. You know, I mean, it's curious to me, I mean, even just as a policy matter, that this legislation would intend to exclude people who are green card holders, permanent residents. As I understand the legislation, but I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong, they also would not be part of the apportionment. But this was not some incidental matter when the Constitution was first written. You'll remember the 3/5 clause was added to the Constitution all about the subject of how do you count the population of enslaved people for purposes of reapportionment. And of course, the northern states were saying, well, if the enslaved people are not going to be able to vote or run for office, they shouldn't be counted at all. For these purposes, the slave states were saying, yeah, they should be counted 100%, and they arrived at the infamous 3/5 compromise for purposes of counting. Interestingly, a lot of people don't understand that it was the northern states who were saying they shouldn't be counted at all. It should be 0% if they're not going to be able to vote and to participate. And it was the slave states who were saying, well, we'd love to count the enslaved people. We want them to count for the purposes of enlarging our congressional base, but they're not going to be able to participate. And after the first census and reapportionment took place in 1800, there were about a dozen additional members of our body who were added from slave states because of the fact that 60% of the enslaved population was counted for these purposes.
I think you also referenced the fact that the census is not just used for apportionment, and that has been a very real concern, the citizenship question that there was an effort by the Trump administration to foist it upon the 2020 census documents. But it actually harms states where there's a significant immigrant population and if people are afraid to be counted because of that. In terms of apportionment of federal funding, whether it's for highways or bridges, which people tend to use regardless of their citizenship status. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's right. I mean, this has been the functional rule for all of American history. We want to know where the population actually is that has to be served by government and protected by government and so on. So, look, I think our time would be better spent trying to convince our colleagues to go with the bipartisan compromise that came out of the Senate that was basically vetoed by Donald Trump, who said he didn't want a border solution, he wanted a border crisis to run against. And so, you know, what we need is effective legislative bipartisan work to make real progress on this. But, you know, this, as I said, is unconstitutional window dressing. And I just keep thinking back to my years on this committee when Chairman Cole would just say, there's no way this is going to go through the Senate. There's no way this can be signed by the president, and it can't pass in the court, so why are we wasting our time with it?
I do recall when we went through the 2020 census that some of the politicians who were most loudly talking about needing to just count citizens and exclude immigrants tended to be from states like Arizona and Texas, and then complained when the census caused them to lose population because, in fact, they had managed to scare people into not completing the census forms. So I think it is be careful what you wish for, even if it were constitutional, but it's not, so we should probably move on. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Biggs, if you have anything you wanted to respond to some of that conversation.
Yes, thank you. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with the microphones. It's a real problem for me. First of all, if possible, I'd like to submit for the record the CBO cost estimate of this bill, which is less than $500,000 over a 5-year period, which indicates that there will be very little suppression of the federal funds. So, thank you. So I also want to talk about the Evanwell case that my colleague seems to be so reliant on, which in some respects I think he's right in his interpretation, but in other respects there was little notation that Justice Ginsburg said at one point in there as she's talking about the pernicious three-fifths compromise that had been made, and that post-Civil War, as they wanted to make sure that people were counted, that's why they used the term whole, to move it from the three-fifths to make sure there was whole. That is merely notation. It's dicta. It doesn't mean much. But it does get a little bit, provide some interest. But actually, language in the 14th Amendment, Section 2 itself is really instructive as well, because the language there talks specifically and makes delineation, because it talks about people who are disqualified to vote. And they will be reduced from the apportionment, it says. Now, that's interesting language to me. It's interesting language to me. And, very interesting. I also thought it was interesting when the gentlelady was referring to Wyoming as debasing Pennsylvania's one man, one vote rule because Wyoming gets one constitutionally, because it does. It does. But I don't think when you have one of the 50 states of the union that they don't qualify. I mean, they wouldn't get one otherwise unless the Constitution didn't specifically prescribe it, which it does. No state shall have less than one, right? And then this argument that Arizona lost seats because I don't even know where that comes from. All I know is that Arizona continues to be one of the fastest growing states in the country, as does Texas, as most of the Sun Belt states are, which are the freer states in the union, oddly enough. So getting back to this bill, it's not clearly unconstitutional. In fact, it is the exact opposite. It is clearly, rationally, totally constitutional, and I encourage your support for it.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs, and I will just say, I did have some other questions, but between the last two answers, you answered all of my questions. So, no, I appreciate it, because then I could, take notes. And the one thing I will say is that I do agree with Chair Burgess when he said most people think this is the case, and it seems that would be the common sense of it, is to do it that way. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for presenting this. I'm sitting here listening, and as I've heard the argument, and I've read the Constitution, it's really clear. Right? So that's why this is so amazing, because you have a Constitution that's very clear. There is no doubt about what it says. It says we shall count all persons. Right?
It's perfectly clear.
Perfectly clear. And then you have a Supreme Court that has ruled a unanimous opinion. There was some disagreements and concurrences, but a Supreme Court opinion. This matter is settled.
Well, in fact, I mean, I respect our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who filed constitutional amendments to change it. There are certainly some who say we should change this by constitutional amendment. That's the intellectually honest way to go.
Right. If we wanted to be intellectually honest, we'd have a constitutional amendment presented, and we could move from there. So, but the argument I've heard on the other side is they've talked about undocumented. They use a different term, but I don't think any person is really illegal. But they've talked about that there are the undocumented members. Is there anything in this bill that makes a difference between people who have their resident status or not resident status? I didn't see it. Is there?
And I do not see that
Yeah.
at all. And I would hope that all of us still welcome legal immigration. It's very tough to get into the country legally. I think only like 2% or 2.5% every year get in that way. And I'm for a system that makes it a lot easier to get in the country lawfully and a lot harder to get in the country unlawfully. But this would say we're not even going to count the people who've played by the rules and waited and are going to be in the process. That totally defeats the constitutional design. And, but I don't want to be ill-mannered, but it also betrays the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, who was adamant about this point, that people who were so-called declarant aliens, that is, what we would call permanent residents, aliens who've come, who've signed up and are waiting 5 years, his party, the Republican Party, supported those people's right to vote.
And we're not even asking for that. All we're suggesting is that we not take up a bill that would be unconstitutional.
That would erase them from their constitutional status, which is just being counted,
Right.
not giving them the right to vote. It doesn't give them any particular benefit. It just says they are counted because the framers were adamant that everybody in the country be part of the census and the reapportionment.
So when I go out, I just came from my district, and we had some wonderful events out there. When I go and I have a town hall, when I go and I dedicate water, wastewater infrastructure, when we look at all the manufacturing that we're bringing in because of the Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law and the great work we did last Congress, I don't go out there and say, well, I'm only going to talk to you people who are citizens. Do you do that when you go talk to your voters back home, your communities back home? It's voters, it's communities, it's workers. We're not going around asking them these questions, are we? Because we have to represent. Our job is to represent the entire community. And that community is made up of citizens. It's made up of legal residents. It's made up of a whole variety of people who are in different kinds of status here in the country, usually contributing greatly, as we now know, under the CBO. If we wouldn't have had the immigrant population, we would not be in the recovery than we are. What do you do when you go to your district? Do you ask those kinds of silly questions?
Well, I mean, I'm sure every member of this committee spends a lot of time with children who don't vote because they're not given the right to vote, but they're definitely counted for the purposes of census and reapportionment.
Right, and you know what else, when you were talking about the idea that we were counting, that when the Constitution was written, we were also not counting Native Americans.
Unless they were taxed.
Unless they were taxed, right? Yeah. So there was different things that we were not doing, but the Constitution was pretty clear. You count, and then you apportion. And there was a law that addresses that, and it doesn't deal with this. So the other thing that I find interesting is that in Texas, after California, Texas has the largest immigrant population. They would lose 6 seats. North Carolina could lose 1. Arizona could lose 1 if they wanted to go this route. But what's interesting is I've seen a map that looks at who would not be represented, like who would not have their voices heard. Because like I said, when I come here, I'm not just thinking of people who voted for me, whether they're Republican or Democrat. I'm thinking of the community that needs my help. And the Southwest would be really hard hit. Even New Mexico would be hard hit. About 35% of the people would lose, in essence, their representation. And that bothers me a lot. I think what we need to be about is increasing representation, is making sure that we respond in a much better fashion to the communities that we represent, and not going about this kind of silliness about trying to game the system to increase one party or another representation in Congress, which this smells like that's exactly what this is about.
Well, I think that's right. The framers, if you read the Northwest Ordinance, they were of the mind that territories were always like states in training. They would become states eventually. And I think that was very much their attitude about people who came to the country. They were citizens in training, citizens in waiting. There weren't all these blockades put up. Now, we might be in a different time where people want that, but we've got to amend the Constitution if you really want to start drawing constitutional lines in this way.
Right, and so many residents have chosen to become citizens, and in essence, we would be saying, well, you might be in the process of becoming citizens. Where do we draw the line? We need to be able to represent everybody who is in our district, and that's why the districts are drawn the way they are. And with that, Mr. Chair, unless you want to add anything else, with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the vice chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman has no questions. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank both of you for coming. Mr. Biggs, Mr. Raskin mentioned suppression. Who's being suppressed on a phone call I got from South Carolina, a resident in South Carolina, that 4 plane loads of illegals were coming into South Carolina, going to the Medicaid office to get registered to vote. Who is being suppressed on the payment for the flights that are coming in?
So the term that has been used in the canon of cases that deal with this would say debased. So it would be those whose one man, one vote status would be debased, and that would be the citizens who are paying the way for these folks to get here, and that would be the citizens who can vote for federal officials who are having their vote diluted.
So would the same apply to, Mr. Scott, I got a call also from 4 plane flights coming into Atlanta, Georgia. Same thing. They're being suppressed, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
And I thought we had the power of the purse string, but evidently this president is running ramshot over that.
Well, that's, Mr. Norman, that gets to the point, one of the points I was trying to make earlier, maybe inartfully, I don't know. But you've never seen the type of movement, it's almost a gathering, if you will, literally millions upon millions of people coming into this country illegally, and they're going to various locations throughout the country. And at the same time, we don't suppress legal immigrants. We have over 1 million every year that come in legally, and we try to facilitate that. But what happens is, when you bring in the kind of numbers of those who come into the country illegally, and this is who we know of, 9.2 million, that's what this administration has copped to. You also have millions who we don't know. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know where they're going. And it behooves us, actually, when you conduct your census, to try to find out who's here legally, who's here as a citizen. That's really what we're trying to get at. Are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? We only think citizens should vote.
And the most recent report I saw on Epoch Times said before this administration is done, there'll be close to 15 million that are in this country illegally, we're being paid the price tag, not to mention the cost of the deaths of the Lincoln Riley, of the thousands of young people who are dead because of fentanyl. And this president, this administration is doing this for power and for votes. It's now clear this is why he's doing it. Is there any other reason you can think of?
I can think of a lot of reasons, but I don't know what this president's rationale is. All I know is that he calmly raised his hand saying that, and early on in his presidency urged people to rush the border, quoting.
Well, thank you for what you're doing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back chair. Thanks. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Yeah, I just have a few questions. I'd just like to ask each of the panelists, how many people do you think are in the United States right now illegally?
So, Mr. Roy, it's impossible to say, but I can tell you that for a good 20-year period from the early 2000s until about 2 years ago, the number that was often quoted by media types was 11 million. They now, the numbers that I hear now are consistently between 20 and 40 million illegally in the country.
How many people? And now I'll allow Mr. Raskin to answer. So the illegal that was sort of what we sort of generally referred to as illegally present. How many, in general, how many people here who are non-citizens, legally plus illegally? Do you know?
Non-citizens is around 50 million. You got 22 million? Oh, okay. The number I just was given by staff is 22 million.
On the what, illegal number?
No, I think that's the legal foreign residents.
Do you know, Mr. Raskin?
Yeah, but I thought it was generally around 20 million who are lawful non-citizens in different categories, mostly permanent resident green card holders. And the number I've seen kicked around for undocumented is something like 10 or 12 million.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because I've seen wildly varying numbers. Various studies. I mean, MIT has a study they did with Yale or somebody, I can't remember, it was a joint study. Then there was some other studies that have showed the numbers, and they vary wildly. My point of asking is bifurcating the questions that are presented by the legislation, right, into should we find out who is here and whether they are citizens or not, and how to do that. Is it surveys? Is it via the census question? And then the second question, of course, is then what to do about that vis-a-vis apportionment and the constitutional questions and legal questions that flow from that. So on the first question, what I wanted to say, because it was posited earlier, and I wanted Mr. Raskin and Mr. Biggs can answer the question for good of everybody about whether or not the court, in responding to President Trump and I guess Commerce Secretary Ross's efforts on the question, was whether that said that Congress couldn't act. I thought it was speaking directly to the executive branch's actions as opposed to just Congress. But I'd like both of you to respond to that. Ms. Raskin, you start, Mr. Biggs.
Yeah, but I read it the same way, Mr. Roy. But here's what Section 2 of the 14th says. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So in defining the whole number of persons, the court has been emphatic that that means the whole number of persons in the plain meaning sense and not the whole number of voters or citizens or.
So again, that to me gets to the second part of the question. In this legislation, right, we're posing two pieces to it. One is whether we ask. Do we just simply want to know? And we put that on the question and say, okay, are you a citizen or not? And then get that information from 330 million or whatever kids, people responding. And we get all that information, we figure out, okay, are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? Are you legally here or are you not legally here? It strikes me that that is just a basic function of government, that we should do that. Now, there's questions that are raised in opposition to that about whether that would scare people, and they're not going to, all the things, all the political questions. But I just want to kind of bifurcate the questions because the argument, which is debatable, about the 14th Amendment interpretation and how it would apply, what the court would do or not, that's one question. The first question that I just kind of want to make sure I understand is, with respect to the court's opinion vis-a-vis Trump, Ross et al. In 2020 and the census, I read that to mean that was talking about their executive action on that. Congress, they left open whether Congress could do it or not, or maybe even explicitly said Congress could do it. I haven't read the opinion in a while.
Mr. Roy, they specifically said Congress can ask citizenship questions.
Couldn't remember if it was open or explicit. So my point being, if we believe, arguments notwithstanding, debate on the floor, that it is in the interest of the country to ask the question and just say, are you a citizen or not? Let's collect that information. Now let's do something with it. Now maybe that doing something with it might be seem nefarious to others and some on different issues or whatever, but it seems to me a just basic, obligation on our part to say that, yeah, the federal government ought to know the people who are in this country. Are you here? Are you a citizen? Are you here legally? And so forth. And then the policy prescription should flow from that. Again, I understand the argument will be that people who are here illegally, they don't want to fill out the forms. They're not going to say they're here. So then you're going to say they're undercounting. So you got people who are here who aren't done, don't have papers. They don't want to answer the question. I get all those arguments. But I'm just saying, as a prudential matter as a nation, shouldn't we know who's here? And shouldn't we do that without just guessing? I think that's my question. Either way, yeah. Mr.
Well, no, but I think you've analyzed it correctly. I think you've got the arguments right. But you're just addressing the first point,
right?
That this would be optional to do and arguably constitutional to do. And there might be equities on both sides, but appended to it is a clearly unconstitutional provision.
Well, and if I can just respond to that, I think it's far less clearly unconstitutional than my colleague asserts.
So what you're talking about? You're talking about the second?
Yeah, we're talking about the apportionment because there is no mandate in any of the canon of law that's interpreted this that is requiring.
Could the gentleman pause for 1 second? Because I want to address that question separately. But do we agree it is constitutional, lawful, Congress can do it, it's a prudential question, should we or should we not put a question on the census to determine whether or not you're a citizen or not? It's just a question of policy for us. So I want to separate those questions about whether it's constitutional or not. And then another question is, if we pass this legislation that has the two components to it, you shall ask the question, and then when you get that, you shall apportion based on citizenship, right? That's effectively what the bill says, right? that if the court were to strike down the second part, would that necessarily strike down the first part?
No, there's a severability clause.
Right. I think it's
argue there's a
important for
severability
the
clause.
body to know that. So we pass the legislation, you put that forward, you have the first component, should we know? Great, that's a good question. We can debate that policy. Second question is then should it apply for apportionment? Should that mandate on apportionment then survive constitutional scrutiny?
Yeah,
And so then I think that now begs that question on whether it would survive constitutional scrutiny. Now, gentlemen, please proceed with your thoughts, and then Mr. Raskin, yours, which you've already said about Section 14.
Mr. Raskin and I have a strong disagreement on the constitutionality. He quotes a portion of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, but doesn't quote all of it. Because when you go to the back end of that same section, you'll see that there's a delineation and specific language that talks, with at least regard to the Electoral College, that apportionment can be lost because of disqualification of electors or voters. So that becomes an interesting dynamic to me. But I would also assert that our bill is consistent with my reading, at least certainly from dicta in Evanwall, that kind of gets to a different interpretation of whole. Even in that front section, you're not talking total. That becomes the real language. It's the total number. That's what they are asserting. And I'm asserting that this bill does not affect certainly the states. But
My question that I'd ask Mr. Raskin, what's the limiting principle? Like, is there one?
To what?
To the question of whether it's a genuine question for a friend what would be the limiting principle on who is counted? So
Well, the census has said they don't count people who are, tourists from France who are in town. You've got to be living in the country.
right, but is there a length of time that and so my point is though. So this. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
domicile, as you know, is defined as physical presence with intention to remain. And maybe there's some grayness around the margins on that, but basically we know people who are physically present and intend to remain.
This is shady for me in terms of my recollection, but I remember certain aspects of the history of this has also to do with not just physical presence, but allegiance and questions involving that. And so whether or not you're here and have allegiance to the United States or, that those questions are relevant. And certainly we acknowledge that Congress, like in terms of interpreting the question, Congress has had to deal with figuring out the number of representatives that we have and, make decisions all the time. It's one person, one vote, but it's 750,000, as effective as 112,000 as it was at one point in time. I just made that number up, but whatever it was at some point mathematically. But my point is just, clearly there is room for congressional and executive interpretation and application, right, of what in fact it means to be here and be a person counted and define that, right? And and clearly in the past we've asked questions of citizenship, like 1830 to 1950 or something like that. So I guess my point is, I don't know that it's absolute that the assertion on the constitutional question. But my point would be, if Congress believes we should do it, we have divisions on that question. If Congress believes that we should do it, I don't see the problem in passing forward something that we believe is, especially if you can argue, if you believe it's clearly unconstitutional, then you have an obligation to vote no. Absolutely. But if you think that there's a legitimate constitutional argument that you think that you could say that, yeah, I think you can count them under my reading of the Constitution and application of it, and we should at least get the information. Send it to the court, or send it to the court. It gets litigated, the court gets it. Wherever they come down on the question, then we would just debate whether we amend the Constitution in the absence of that. But is that, roughly how you gentlemen see it?
That's pretty much how I see it. Yeah. When Mr. Biggs said, that there's another provision in the 14th Amendment which allows for reduction of the congressional delegation, that's true. That's if there's disenfranchisement of at that point, it was the male African-American population, then you could reduce the congressional districts by a proportionate amount. But again, that's written in the Constitution. So, I take your basic point, which is you want to say, if you divide these two parts of the legislation, the first one could be voted on as a matter of policy, and of course, we have just a fundamental disagreement about whether that makes any sense to do it and why we would be doing it. I think it's Section 2 that gives the explanation for why it's being done, because they do want to use what's basically an unconstitutional formula for apportioning congressional districts. One that I think, and I appreciate, I know you are a man of principle, Mr. Roy, but I think your state would probably be hurt more than almost any other state in the union by this.
I think we would potentially lose a number of seats. Yes, what those are, the gentlelady posited 7 seats, I think, or six seats as a possible suggestion, which 4.5 million people, which tells me that we have a firm recognition of how many people are here who are not, who are undocumented and or documented and not citizens. That it is a very large number. Sure, yeah, of course.
So it's really important because we keep hearing you talk about undocumented.
I said both.
Yeah, but that number includes documented.
Right, I said both.
Yeah, and I think I know, but I think it's really clear that we recognize that this impacts everybody who is here and residing, regardless of status of documentation. And that's really important to acknowledge, that this is a sledgehammer approach to an issue. If you have this issue, I think you can take it up in a way that Mr. Raskin has noted.
Reclaim my time is, I've been saying both documented and undocumented. It's questions the numbers, right? We have, again, wildly varying estimates on the undocumented population, certainly a lot more than we do the documented non-citizen population, which has a massive impact in a number of different directions on that. My only point is to say is that if we're assuming 4.5 million in Texas, roughly, which is what the number would reflect if we're talking about 6 members of Congress, roughly, then we're assuming a very, very large number. And I'm just glad to acknowledge the numbers that we're talking about. The last question on this is, I just wanted to raise the issue on the legal immigration issue, because that's posited a lot. But I just wanted to kind of clarify it. I've seen a significant number of studies that suggest that there's about roughly 51 million foreign-born individuals in the United States, which reflects 16-ish% of the population, which puts it at the highest percentage we've ever had in our history in terms of calculating it. It's higher than the early 20th century when we had the explosion of immigration in late 19th century, early 20th century. And currently, legally, to the best of the numbers that I have provided, and I know both of you are well-informed individuals. Obviously, Mr. Biggs has a lot of knowledge on the board of Arizona and committees of jurisdiction. But we've been running at roughly about 1 million people a year with some dips. I mean, in 20, because of COVID, and 21, there was a fall off in the 700,000 range, 740, back up to 22 and at 1 million. All of the teens was over 1 million a year. And I just wanted to, just for the purpose of the record, at least acknowledge whatever the percentages are in terms of applicants, our country remains a massively large door of individuals coming into the United States. If you're still talking about 1 million a year legally on top of or separate from the population who's coming in through other channels, legally, illegally, et cetera. Would you agree with that, Mr. Biggs?
Yeah, more so than virtually all other countries combined, every year we allow legal migration. And I just want to make one, I do think it's rich with irony, when people claim that the language saying that this is unconstitutional is clear as it can be, but then refuses to use statutory language, even terms of art, on illegal aliens. I find that's rich with irony. I really do. Because, I mean, even Sting understands You have legal aliens and illegal aliens, and that's why in his song, Englishman in New York, he actually uses the term, actually correctly, the term of art, the statutory term. I just had to raise this, just a little cron.
Mr. Raskin, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I agree with my friend from Texas so much, but I guess I just celebrate that fact. I mean, this is the greatest country in the world. Of course everybody wants to come here. I mean, you know, Tom Paine, when he came over from the UK, he fell in love with the promise of America. He said, this land, if it lives up to its values, will be an asylum to humanity.
And I
Not an insane asylum.
I appreciate
like,
that from my friend from Maryland. I would say that we can agree on that point. But all I'm trying to do is establish for the record, for the average listener, the average American, that we're going about 1 million a year on top of our current population, which is roughly 50 million foreign born, the highest percentage in history. We can say good, bad, how we teaching, how we, you know, how do people adopt and, you know, build our country? Like, how do we have unity as a country? These are all questions that we should be wrestling with as Americans. I'm just saying it's a very big number,
if you
especially when you add in parole and asylum.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I have in my office frequently people from the hotel industry, people from the construction industry, retail saying we need people, we need more workers in the country. The hotels, we're looking for workers. Yeah.
I would argue we should also stop paying people not to work, but that's a different debate for a different day. All I really wanted to do is say here is, well, I mean, the gentleman can look down, but we have a massive welfare state. And as Milton Friedman famously said, he'd love to have wide open borders if you don't have a welfare state. So we do have $34.5 trillion of debt and all the things that flow from that, and we do have problems we've got to deal with. All I want to do here, because all we're talking about is citizenship and census, is establish that we're talking about a question to know whether you're a citizen, and establish that we are bringing into this country roughly 1 million people a year, and we have 50.x million foreign born. So hardly a closed door, hardly a hey, you know, you're not welcome. It's more of a question of trying to figure out how are we managing that? How are we dealing with that? And I'll make only one other point is that with respect to Texas, is we have we're a donor state still with respect to transportation dollars, which was the example used before in terms of tax dollars versus roads received, and you know the 10th biggest economy in the world. I think. You know, the idea that apportionment is all about printing money and then doling it out, I think is a mistake. I think, because that's what we're doing. It's not like we're responsibly doing something to figure out how to allocate. We're literally just printing money and mortgaging the future to then dole it out to states based on apportionment. But with that, I'll yield back for the interest of time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, all I want to do here is end this hearing. I mean, the one thing I do know is that this bill isn't going anywhere. I think we've talked about it quite a bit, and I have nothing further to add. I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point that the severability clause is something that I was going to make that had not been brought up yet. And I understand, Mr. Raskin, that you don't agree with Section 3, which is the reapportionment.
Correct, yeah.
Do you have a problem with Section 2?
But you mean the census question?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that the census question has actually been asked in on the small census, which is actually
the community survey.
A small group of people relative to the whole population, but it gets in greater depth. So it's actually already being used. So we're getting, it's sort of like taking a poll, where you take a, you know.
So it is being asked on the community survey.
The community survey, exactly. Thank you.
So are you opposed to it being asked on the census?
Well, yeah, the
Since it's
point I
already
tried
being
to.
And the community survey, for those of you who don't know, is done by the Census Bureau, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much so. Yeah, the only point I was making about it is that it's a recipe for confusion because, as we can see from this bill itself, the question of whether you're counted immediately gets conflated with the question of should this be used for reapportionment, should it be used for other purposes, and so it ends up having a chilling and deterrent effect on people's participation in the census, and the whole point of the census is to try to get as clear a composite picture as possible.
I disagree with that assessment. And I mean, it's already being asked on the community survey, and they're participating in the community survey. So why wouldn't they participate in the census? It's the same agencies carrying out the question.
Yeah,
But
well, yeah, you'd
me-
have to ask
let me-
some experts of the census, but when I've asked about that question, what they've said is, when you're sending people to go door to door, and you're trying to get the entire population, that over the whole population, you are going to end up having a real deterrent effect on people's participation. When we want to try to get 100% photograph of who's out there.
I disagree with you on that. And there are a couple of ways the courts, I think, could rule on the other section. One is they could rule that it is, that if we pass the law, then it is going to be based on U.S. citizens. They could rule that it should be passed on people who are legally inside the United States, which would be U.S. citizens and those who actually are legally here. I do not think the court would rule that illegal immigrants should be counted in the reinforcement.
You're right, only if it changes its mind from the Evanwell decision where it said it's all persons.
Let me say this. The president this past week referred to the Japanese, one of our allies in the war against China, and India, one of our allies in our alliance against China. Two of the members of the Quad, which is important to our alliance to combat China in their aggression. He referred to those two partners as xenophobic. Do you think that our partners are xenophobic?
But, I didn't see this. Literally have no idea what you're referring to. I mean, I take you at your word, but let me, if you don't mind, let me look into it and I can get back to you on it.
I'm concerned that the President of the United States would use that word, would throw that word around, talking about Japan and India when those two are part of the Quad in our alliance to combat China. I think it was very irresponsible for him to do it, and I think that it shows his mental capacity or lack thereof that he would make such a statement publicly. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I have another submission for the record, if I may.
Yes.
Dim Rep's comment about needing more illegal aliens for redistricting goes super viral.
Without objection, so ordered. I thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. The witnesses are excused.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members.
Good job, Mr. Bates.
And then I would like to welcome our third panel, Representative Mike Flood and Ranking Member Maxine Waters from the Committee on Financial Services.